So hi, my name is Serene Ong. So today's webinar is held by the Southeast Asia Bioethics Network. So in the first place, this Southeast Asia Bioethics Network is in its first, I think, second year already. Yeah, and why was this network set up? The aim of the network was to shape a future research agenda that's based on the voices in the region. So these voices include people who are in effect practicing and producing bioethics, but are perhaps not recognized as bioethicists. And they're also the voices of the marginalized populations, such as migrant workers and refugees, and generally, and quite importantly, the Southeast Asians who come from a multiplicity of faith and cultures. So we want to think about how we might think differently about bioethics issues raised based on these voices, and where appropriate, how we can help to bring about positive change where possible. So to this end, the original steering committee applied and received the Wellcome Research Development Award in Humanities and Social Science. It is a 5-year developmental grant that will lay the foundation for research that takes risks and pushes academic boundaries. The current steering committee consists of, in clockwise direction from top left, Teck Chuan from Singapore Health Services, Chapet Yong from Medical Oxford Tropical Medicine Research Unit, Oxford University, Tamara Lysat from University of Sydney, Sharon Kaur from University of Malaya, myself from National University of Singapore, and Muhammad Firdaus Abdul Aziz from University of Malaya. So we have 9 advisory board members who hail from around the globe. They include Professor Adiba Kamarul Zaman, Professor Michael Parker, Dr. Catherine Littler, Ms. Adrian Hunt, Professor Graham Laurie, Dr. Kolita Wikaramage, Professor Jane Kale, Professor Jeremy Sugarman, and Dr. Carla Sense. So the network focuses on 2 thematic areas. First, healthcare for and research with mobile and marginalized populations. The second area is emerging health and biomedical technologies. So our activities include stakeholder engagement, academic activities in thematic areas such as this webinar, and funding opportunities. For example, we engage stakeholders in workshops. The photo on the right shows a workshop we conducted last year in Langkawi. 26 participants from Southeast Asia, all around the region, except Myanmar and Timor-Leste, attended. So the objective of this workshop was to formulate the vision, mission, and values of the network. We also conducted a modified Delphi survey during the workshop to gather input and build consensus for a research agenda by identifying research priorities in thematic areas. So these are the vision, mission, and values that came out from that workshop. I won't bother to read this out. Instead, please go to our website. The link is below to find out more. And a little bit about our academic activities. This is a selected list. Comprises webinars, workshops, and public forums. So again, for more information, especially up-to-date information, please visit the network's website under the page called Events. So of note is that a number of our activities are collaboration with partners in the region. The ethical oversight of AI workshop in January 2024, this year, was a collaboration with a researcher from the International Islamic University Malaysia under a Global Forum on Bioethics in Research Meeting Fellowship Award. In the following month, we held a Migration Health in Southeast Asia workshop, which was a collaboration with the Migration Health and Development Research Initiative. We also provide funding opportunities, and I encourage everyone who is interested to go to our website to find out more. The grant call for this year is closed, but please go and have a look so you can prepare for next year. Right, thank you. Chuan.
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks, Serene. My name is Teck Chuan. I'm a fellow steering committee member of the network with Serene, and I'll be moderating today's webinar with her. So we have three excellent speakers today: Angus Dawson, Caesar Atuire, as well as Dr. Mark Tan, or shall I say Dr. Mark Tan. Mark just recently, he's a medical doctor who recently just got his PhD in bioethics. So congratulations to Mark from all of us. Today we have Angus, who will be speaking on the concept of decolonization and its implications for bioethics. Caesar will be giving us an African perspective, and Mark will be sharing with us his views on the relevance of bioethics decolonization to those of us who are based in Southeast Asia and perhaps beyond in other regions. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes. After each talk, we have about 5 minutes for you in the audience to raise questions to the speaker to either clarify or to get the speaker to explain more about what he said. Don't worry if you can't get your questions in time within the 5 minutes after each talk. We have budgeted about 20 minutes at the end of all the talks for Q&A. Some further house rules. Feel free to turn on your video. It's good for speakers to see faces, I think, but do keep your microphone muted to avoid background noise and interruptions. If you have any questions, including any technical issues, please just use the chat box to raise them. Okay. And so, as you were to raise your questions during a Q&A, for example, the moderators and us and the panel speakers can look at those questions and we address them as much as possible. So, decolonization of bioethics, is there really a need for bioethics to be decolonized? Why is this important to all of us? I suppose it's about challenging us to move away from a pure Western or Western-centric approach to bioethics, but not to completely do away with ways of thinking from the West, right? The problem, I think, is not where the ideas, values, principles, success metrics come from, but how they might dominate and constrain our way of thinking, such that we don't see other ways of doing research, how we teach, or make bioethics policies and decisions better relative to our context. That's just my viewpoint, and we'll hear now from Angus, who will speak on the concept of decolonization and its implications for bioethics. Angus is Professor of Bioethics at the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the National University of Singapore. He has worked in many places, including Australia, Canada, and the UK. He was the joint founder of the journal Public Health Ethics and remains its joint editor-in-chief. I think he's one of the founders or fathers of public health ethics. Angus also works on philosophical methodology and bioethics and also non-Western bioethics. He's also a keen photographer, and I can see it on his slide already. Over to you, Angus.
Thank you very much, TC. It's great to be here, and thanks to the organizers for asking me to say a few words. So this is what I'm going to talk a little bit about. Basically, the focus of my talk is thinking a little bit about how we can encourage a greater diversity of voices, both within the region, but also more broadly in relation to bioethics. And I think some of this comes from a frustration that I felt in relation to the limitation that there often is in terms of who's involved in conversations, and the ethical language that's used, the sort of narrowness of the ideas and the concept, and the tendency to dismiss different ideas and values from other traditions. So of course it's a bit ironic, isn't it, that I am a white European from the UK. I think you could make out a pretty good case that I've been a beneficiary of colonialism. But the reason why I think I've been asked to talk is that I have a strong and growing interest in thinking about what bioethics might look like from a non-Western perspective. So, as I mentioned, the focus of this talk is to try and provide some broad mapping of what different ideas in relation to a non-Western way of thinking about bioethics, how that might relate to these ongoing ideas about different thoughts about post-colonialism and related concepts. I'll say a little bit more about that on my second slide. But for those of you that sort of don't know who I am or where I'm coming from, I've been basically arguing for the last 25 years that a lot of the values in relation to how we analyze and construct arguments in bioethics are too narrow in terms of the literature and the values that they draw upon. And my particular research area, as TC mentioned, is in public health ethics. And I originally started off thinking about what difference does it make to think about bioethical issues from the perspective of public health, and what are the values that are part of the practice of public health, and how can we use these ideas, a concern about the structural features that shape how we think about and how our health is viewed, ideas about power and so on, and these different values like equity, sustainability, solidarity, community, and so on. How could they actually be used to engage more with different topics in bioethics? So this is where I'm coming from. It's a sympathetic and wanting to be supportive of trying to encourage a greater diversity of voices in bioethics. The second thing I wanted to say was just about why I've got post-colonial question mark is the focus or the title of this session this afternoon is post-colonialism. And I think it's really interesting to ask the question about what actually that means, and whether we need to avoid the idea that we're somehow already in some kind of post-colonial period. I think there's a danger that we can just be rather complicit and just assume that we're talking about the old days of colonialism, and we're kind of past that. And really the focus of what I want to talk about is what we might think of as being neo-colonialism. And what I want to suggest is that the dominant kind of ideas and means of expression, and even the language of particular kinds of frameworks and so on, adopts a particular approach, which is one which is neo-colonial in that perhaps the project is a different one from that of historical colonialism, but there are interesting parallels to think about in relation to how these dominant ideas are very often just assumed to be the right ones, and they have a particular tradition that comes from particular places and particular ways of thinking. And I think a very good question to ask, and the key one that I'll be really focusing on here, is thinking about the appropriateness of those particular ways of thinking for work that's done within the Southeast Asian region. Now, of course, one of the reasons why I think a lot of these ideas and assumptions are or could be viewed as neo-colonial is because of the expression of these ideas in using the English language and the power that English language has in relation to its dominance in relation to global bioethics and global scholarship more directly. And of course, in the background, there is a whole set of power issues to do with which particular countries in the world either historically or contemporary sense, have a lot of power and dominate how we think about these things. And then I think we could also ask some questions about whether this kind of language of post-colonialism, whether it goes far enough and whether we need to adopt a more explicitly anti-colonial language. So if you accept the broad thrust of what I'm suggesting here in relation to neo-colonialism, then it might be that we have to move into something which is more of an anti-colonial phase of thinking about bioethics as we try and unpack some of these more neo-colonial ideas. So what do I mean by thinking about bioethics as a neo-colonial project? As I've already suggested, some of this is to do with various kind of power relationships within academia, looking at this from a global perspective. But really what I want to focus on is more at the intersection of meta-ethics and normative ethics in relation to how a lot of work is conducted in relation to bioethics. And this is both bioethics as an academic project, but also the kind of policy work that gets done at the international level by various kind of international bodies, whether they're WHO or UNESCO or some of the other international organizations. A lot of that work proceeds, I think, on the basis of an assumption that we ought to operate using a model of top-down process. So by that, I mean that we formulate a set of principles or a particular theory. That's the top bit, it's the theory first kind of idea, and that we then literally apply those in a particular context. Now, if that approach was the correct one, of course, you could see how a universalistic approach that, assuming it had the correct theory in place, could actually be conducted. And I think a lot of the work that's done in bioethics assumes this kind of idea that we can look at the four principles or a different set of principles or a particular kind of approach, and we can't fairly call this a neo-colonial project because the assumption is made that the particular theory or set of principles that we're proposing are the correct ones. But of course, when you look at many of these the values or principles that are contained in this approach, they tend to be quite a limited range. And as I mentioned before, the work that I've been doing for some time in relation to thinking about public health ethics has been trying to argue that a lot of the traditional ways of thinking about bioethics have been individualistic in their assumptions or the kinds of values that tend to get priority. There are some other issues here which maybe we can come back to more in discussion. I won't say too much about, but I think the overwhelming idea here is that there's a set of assumptions about how we ought to do our ethical work, which is essentially what I would call an external critique. It's an external critique because the particular approach that we're taking on this top-down approach to thinking about ethics is one that stands outside of any particular culture. That's what I mean by an external approach. So we have this universal set of values or principles which we just assume can then be used to as some kind of external set of values or rules or principles to critique any particular practice, any particular place or set of values, any particular society. And one of the things that made me get interested in this idea is both supervising and examining PhD students from low and middle income countries, and how often in looking at their work, there was what I have labeled a narrative of failure that was given, that I think is encouraged by this approach, this top-down kind of idea about this external critique of a particular practice or set of practice. So on this kind of idea, it's very common in this work to have, for example, if we're thinking about research ethics, we would have a description of the international guidance that's given in relation to research ethics, and then local practice in a particular country or a particular culture would then be judged against that metric and would, broadly speaking, be found wanting. So that's why I refer to it as a narrative of failure. There's a kind of there's an implicit endorsement of a set of assumptions about the international guidance, which is, I would argue, very often structured around a very limited set of values or principles. There's no attempt to engage with the local. And it's very easy to see how you then end up with this narrative of failure. And a question that I want to raise is the degree to which within the Southeast Asian region, we want to maybe accept that as being a suitable kind of approach. Because you could imagine that maybe we see a whole series of papers written by fantastic PhD students in the future that adopted this kind of general approach. What I want to suggest is that we could actually try and encourage a different alternative account, which can look towards different ideas about taking seriously the local, particular sets of practices related to the starting point that people have. And these could be very different depending upon the particular context that we're talking about. So different countries might have different social values. They might have a different religious or values basis to them. And that would be the starting point for an individual, and that would be valued and taken seriously and built up from that exploration and articulation of the local up to the theoretical, rather than that being judged by this kind of external metric which comes from the international guidance. And of course, the international guidance there is just assumed to be the correct way to think about things. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that I'm sure many people on this call do empirical work in relation to bioethics, and a potentially really important justificatory reason for doing empirical work is to take more seriously this kind of bottom-up approach that I'm advocating for here. The thought is that it's really important to understand how the local actually works, how various kinds of concepts might be used within a particular set of practices as a way to understand what's actually going on, rather than coming in with this external critique and using that to make a judgment about the degree to which there has been a failure to abide by international guidance. And now time is limited, but there's lots to say here. And of course, the pushback that I always tend to get in advocating for these kinds of ideas is the thought that, oh, well, this is just a commitment to relativism. Now, I think there's a good response that can be given here to say, no, it's just that the kind of more accepting of thinking about ethics as a practice within a cultural kind of setting means that the kind of appropriate normative judgments need to be sensitive to the particular kinds of context. And of course, it's going to be no surprise that there's going to be a great deal of overlap between different kinds of cultural practices, because many of these are based upon long traditions, and as human beings, as certain kinds of biological and social creatures, we have a lot in common. And the wisdom that comes from different kinds of cultural traditions is at least partly based around ensuring that as individuals, as communities, we can actually flourish both as individuals and as communities. So it's no real surprise that there is a great deal of overlap here between different kinds of cultural traditions. So as an example of the kind of more embedded, more culturally aware way of thinking about ethics, I wanted to mention this great paper that I came across when I was involved in the workshop on migration that was in Bangkok, that was mentioned by Serene at the beginning of this session. And why I think this is a great example of this approach to thinking about more of a bottom-up way of thinking is that this is based around careful empirical work in relation to engaging with communities, trying to understand ideas. But also, you notice there in the title, there's a particular kind of concept which is mentioned in two different languages here, Na and Krengjai. The concept itself can be turned into the English idea to do with something like graciousness. So it's the particular kind of approach to thinking about things when presented with various kinds of benefits that might come from a relationship with the providers of support, and the kind of response that might be given when you're asked to be involved in a research project, for example. So why this is important is that I think we need to understand a local kind of cultural tradition and the dangers that it might present for a sort of acceptance that a international guidance kind of Western way of thinking about things is going to work within every single cultural context. So the concern here is that if you have sets of assumptions about individuals as being autonomous, as being the consumers of information that's given to them so that they can be processed and make a cost benefits analysis in relation to their own interests and then make a judgment here, that's all fine as a story. But if we have evidence that at the local level there is a set of cultural traditions, that means that when people are asked to participate, they are more likely to actually agree to participate, perhaps where otherwise they might be less willing to do so, or maybe they have more less of a focus on thinking about the information that's relevant to their particular context and so on. So I think there are many different papers that could be used as examples of this more bottom-up approach to thinking about ethics. But again, I'll just point out that notice how many of these relate to thinking about empirical work. But when we look at these kinds of studies, we can use that as the basis for making out this more kind of normative argument, which I'm seeking to do here. So, you know, many of these papers, for example, you'll see in fantastic journals like the Asian Bioethics Review. So I'll just end here. Basically, this is my kind of appeal to many people on the call, is to essentially have confidence in your own traditions, embrace the starting point, the and really sort of seek to value your own traditions. As I got down here, I think there is much wisdom in the local, and I think if we start with the local and we're trying to understand why people behave in particular ways because of their traditions, because of their values, because of them being embedded in a set of social and cultural practices, then we have an opportunity to move away from this narrative of failure, as I was calling it before, and we can truly begin to actually encourage people to value their own traditions. And I think what will happen as a result is that the range of values and principles and ideas within bioethics will then broaden out. And I, for one, think that would be a good thing and a step towards addressing some of this, what I referred to before as neo-colonialism, this idea, this set of assumptions that a particular kind of very narrow and very usually individualistic ways of thinking about particular values tends to dominate within bioethics. So thanks, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Angus. We have a few minutes for quick questions to Angus from anyone. If any questions, just put it in the chat box. There's an interesting question from Farid Masood. I wonder if Angus, can you read it? Yeah, I think, I mean, to put it in a broader sense, it can be Pakistan, it can be anywhere else. But the question is that I guess the question is perhaps sometimes a bottom-up approach may not necessarily be the best way to start, and you do need to look for more universalistic values. And sometimes you do need a bottom-up approach. I'm not sure whether this is the best way to reframe the question, but perhaps Angus, you can give your insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so one of the things that I had on my slides that I didn't talk about because I was conscious of time is the difference between ethics and law. So I think one way that we can ensure that there are important kinds of protections is thinking about the role of law and how some of that law might be international law in terms of a set of standards that are universally applied. And that might be somewhere that you look to for a inspiration for thinking about these kind of universal features. The other thing is that I think in relation to the local more broadly, one of the inspirations for me in relation to changing the way that I think about these issues was during my 7 years living in Australia and engaging with people from particularly an Aboriginal background and trying to understand their more about their culture and their values, was noticing that there are particular values which are established within the practice of Aboriginal ways of thinking, such as ideas about sustainability. And you could study how particular different indigenous groups throughout the world, and certainly within our region, have different ideas about how sustainability actually works, because some of that is going to be specific to the particular kind of ecological context. You know, if you live in a desert area, it's going to be very different from if you live in a sort of jungle setting. So the local there is really important. The ideas about how do we sustain, how do we survive within a particular context, that's going to be local. But the idea of sustainability is something that will be shared amongst many, perhaps all indigenous societies. And that's also an idea that can be taken up by people globally. So what I'm really suggesting is that the priority for me today is to try and support and encourage the idea of valuing the local as a step towards addressing some of the neo-colonialism. That doesn't mean that there aren't elements, of course, within a lot of the international discourse that couldn't be taken up and couldn't be important within the local context. It's just that I think at the moment there's an imbalance in relation to the set of assumptions that it is a top-down kind of process.
Thanks, Angus. So I'm reading Farid's comments a little bit more carefully, and he's saying that he finds this to, I mean, what you're speaking on to be similar to what's happening in his country, Pakistan, where religion, for example, is judged against some external criteria. Right. Okay. In interest of time, we'll have our second speaker. We have more questions for Angus afterwards. Our second speaker is Professor Caesar Atuire, right, who's an associate professor of applied philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and Classics at the University of Ghana. He's also the ethics lead for the MSc program in International Health and Tropical Medicine at the Center for Tropical Medicine and Global Health at Oxford. Also of academia, very interestingly, Caesar leads a non-profit organization, Amicus Onless, which operates in healthcare, basic education, vocational skills training, and interestingly, reintegration of returned illegal migrants to Europe in Ghana. So I think this work informs and complements his philosophical commitment to a more ethical world, part of which is to re-examine conceptual frameworks informing bioethics by drawing on philosophical ideas, both African and non-African, to address inequities in global health, with an eye to decolonization and getting us to new ethical frontiers. Caesar also edited a volume on titled Bioethics in Africa, which discusses bioethical problems from an African perspective. And today he'll be talking about decolonization and sharing his views from an African perspective. Over to you, Caesar.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think a number of the things that I will be talking about are similar to what Angus has just presented to us so well. Interestingly, I don't have any slides to share. This is part of what I think is a conversation. And if we're holding a conversation, why should we have slides? So that is what I'm going to try to do. And there are 4 points that I would like to sort of table and then open up for the discussion. I'm coming at decolonization in bioethics in this particular conversation from the African experience. And so the points I'm going to try to discuss, the first point will be a background. The second point is, the moral wrong of colonialism, because if we're going to decolonize, there must be something wrong with colonialism. Then I will talk about coloniality as a system that is pervasive. And then finally, I will try to say, well, what can we do or what should we be doing? I may not have enough time to go over all these points, but I will try anyway to see what we can say. When I think about Africa, and when we ask people about Africa, we think of one unit, Africa, as a continent, as a people. And this word evokes so many feelings, so many associated concepts. But the interesting point that I would like to make is that Africa, as we know it today, is actually a colonial invention. The 54 countries that constitute Africa today are the fruit, actually, of the partition that was carried out in Vienna in the 1880s by European countries that divided up the continent into countries, borders. I come from Ghana, the very north of Ghana. Yesterday, I was up in my little village in the north of Ghana. And part of this ethnic group actually lives in Burkina Faso, in a different country. And to go to Burkina Faso, I need to go through a passport control to visit my own people. And of course, they were colonized by the French and they speak French, and we were colonized by the English and we speak English. So these countries that we have are actually an artificial creation. And this artificial creation was based on the interests of the people who colonized the African continent. And in order to ensure that this form of colonization was able to be effective, a narrative also accompanied it. And this narrative is what we're going to be looking at. So you create a reality that already existed. Of course, the continent existed and people existed in the continent, but we didn't feel that, in the savannah, in the northern part of Ghana, our people did not feel that they were actually the same as the Zulus or the Xhosas in South Africa, because actually, geographically speaking, we are nearer to Europe than we are to the people in Southern Africa. But we've all been lumped together into this reality called Africa, which was othered in its relationship with Europe. And then the way to analyze Africa is always to see it as the other people. So this is the background that we're coming from, and this is what colonialism has created. But then we often think about colonialism and we think about, all the evils that come with colonialism, pilfering of natural resources, slavery, all sorts of things. But if we ask ourselves, morally speaking, from an ethical viewpoint, what is wrong with colonization? Traditionally or historically, colonization was carried out by the Romans, other people, even in Asia, Asian countries have colonized each other. So the question is this: if there is a specific moral wrong, this is the moral wrong that we need to address if we want to decolonize. And what I would say the specific moral wrong of colonization is the subtraction of the agency of peoples and communities to determine who they are and what they want to be. So it is an act of subtraction, and therefore it's an act of injustice. We're taking away these people's agency to self-determine. And not only do we take away the self-determination, the interesting part is this: once you take away that agency, then there is an active effort to substitute that agency with the values and the agency of whoever has colonized. So I subtract your capacity to determine who you are or what you want to be, but not only do I do that, I actively substitute it with what I want you to be. And therefore, we create a center and a periphery. And everything in the periphery is organized in a way that it serves the interests of the center. And any project of decolonization needs to keep these ideas in the background. This is what is happening. This is our lived reality. So we keep looking, as Angus was saying before, we have the external gaze. There's a philosopher from Benin, Paulin Huntonji, who died earlier this year, who speaks about what he calls extroversion. Extroversion is we continue to judge ourselves by looking at other people. They are the standard, and we then have to sort of like judge ourselves by that standard. And if we are not, up to that standard, then we are part of this narrative of failure. Now, what is happening is this. Okay, many countries today are no longer officially colonies. So the flag planting exercise has ended. The Union Jacks, the tricolors, and all that have come out, and we've put up our own flags and our own names and our own currencies. And we say we are now in a post-colonial era. But what we need to keep in mind is that historical experiences do not just end and that is it. Historical experiences leave a legacy. And this legacy can continue even after the official end of what is called, of this historical experience. And let us remember that the experience that is associated with colonialism was a long experience, and its structures are still present. And this is what Kwame Nkrumah in 1964 wrote in his book titled Neo-Colonialism as the Highest Stage of Imperialism. And in that book, Kwame Nkrumah was arguing that, you know, using the forces of capital and knowledge, the colonial powers still continue to control what happens in the former colonies. And so even, so we have neo-colonialism. And then in the post-colonial, some people put a hyphen, others don't put a hyphen to try to see whether we are actually emphasizing whether we are post or we're just living after. But there is a narrative that is coming out of Latin America, which I find quite interesting, is that they insist on the term coloniality. And coloniality is the system that was created by the colonizers. And this system continues today, even without the active presence of the colonizers, because our societies are predicated on that system. Just as I mentioned, the borders and all that, we're still living with those ones. So we are predicated on that system. And that system has three main pillars on which it stands. And these pillars are a pillar of epistemicide, that is the knowledge sector, a pillar of genocide, which is more on race, and a pillar of ecocide. Those are the three things on which the three main columns that hold up a system of coloniality. Now, bioethics as a discipline did not appear in a world that is absent of values and history. The knowledge that was generated in bioethics sits on this particular world structure in which we're living. And therefore, bioethics inherited, consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, depending on how you want to say it, this particular baggage. And in enacting itself, it runs the risk of perpetuating, if not exacerbating, these particular wrongs of colonialism. So, to go into detail, epistemicide, which is basically the killing of knowledge. All peoples everywhere have always had ethics. I mean, without ethics, societies cannot live. Now, if we are trying to generate a bioethics, and we decide to take the values from one particular set, one particular part of the world, and we universalize them without listening to the values that other people elsewhere profess, then we run the risk of committing a form of epistemicide, which is killing of other knowledges, because we are silencing them. And then if we create up a whole academic empire, an empire of knowledge in research, in healthcare, in public health, in such a way that only knowledge that is generated in certain parts of the world by certain people, that knowledge is considered to be the gold standard. I'll give an example, which is comic, but it's tragic as well. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, after the Asian countries were first hit by the disease, by the outbreak, Europe started experiencing cases of COVID-19, especially in Italy, Spain, and then the UK. Let us remember that the last time that Europe had a nationwide outbreak of a disease in a very drastic way was the Spanish flu. So in theory, in reality, most of the experts in Europe who were actually trying to handle this pandemic or this outbreak are simply people who have learned from theory. They do not have a lived experience of managing a nationwide disease outbreak of the dimensions of COVID-19. Yet these people felt they had the authority to tell the whole world what to do. And when I suggested to them, to a particular group that I will not mention, why don't we call in people from Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea who have handled outbreaks of cholera, outbreaks of Ebola, and all that? Let's bring them in to advise you. It was not accepted because knowledge does not come from Liberia, Sierra Leone, or Guinea. Right? So these are forms of epistemicide that are going on. And we do practice it in bioethics, in global health, and we just consider some people as not capable of generating valid knowledge. Now, the other element of epistemicide is this sort of like hasty universalization. The hasty universalization means that you take one particular set of values and you just assume that because these values are grounded in a certain culture and in a certain historical context, they are valid for the whole world. Somebody, in one of the questions, I think religion came up, for example. Why is a secular culture so important to Europe and America? It is because of the historical experience of America and Europe with regard to religion. I mean, the religious wars in Europe were tragic. And Europe, at some point, needed to secularize. The word secularize means century, to live for this century against the religious backgrounds that we're talking about, an otherworldly vision. That is their lived experience with religion. Other peoples in different parts of the world have integrated religion into their existence in a less problematic way. And therefore, if I want to do bioethics and I say, if it is bioethics, it has to be secular, then what I'm doing is that I am misrecognizing the experiences of these other people. And therefore, I am committing an injustice. So we need to be careful about, hasty universalization. And I just mentioned the point of being afraid and scared of what people call ethical or moral relativism. But to be quite honest, I want to ask everybody here, if you have a partner living with you, do you share the same values in everything? Of course you don't. Yet you're able to live together. People do have differences, even in values, but that does not necessarily ensue in conflict. People who come from a strong monotheistic culture tend to be very good at trying to push for universalization and are scared of anything that seems to be a form of a predication of a form of pluriversality. But the truth of the matter is that we all live in a pluriversal universe. And pluriversality must admit of different ways of approaching moral issues. There are shared interests. And with these shared interests, we can actually, through consensus, arrive at global ideals that we can share. But we can come at these global ideals from different angles, and that is possible. Now, the other thing about coloniality, the other 2 points I mentioned, genocide, which is also linked to using morally indifferent biological characteristics to classify people. Yeah, if you are Asian, you are this way. If you are African, you are that way. And we even apply it in healthcare. We make assumptions about people. Doctors in Europe, where I've lived for a long time, think that, because I have a black skin, my skin is thicker. What does that mean? And I'm not going to go into, prejudices about Asians, right? But we even saw that during the COVID-19 outbreak at the beginning, we started actually, discriminating against people just for who they are. And the genocide, okay, we can, in our experience in Africa, it was linked a lot to slavery, which allowed, you had to sort of like declass people to be able to justify slavery. And that went on for many centuries. And then the ecocide, which is this particular relationship with nature. Whereas, let's say, the modern Europe that emerged with the rise of the capitalist and industrial economy has a particular way of dealing with the world in which we live, with nature, which is an extractivist mentality. Many other peoples around the world have a different way of actually dealing with nature. And this even applies with healthcare. If you look at a lot of our language in healthcare, the way we consider bugs and we consider bacteria and viruses, we have a very violent way of thinking about them. As soon as you're prescribed with a disease, everybody says that you have to defeat it. You have to go to war with your body and defeat it. There are philosophies of healthcare that are not so much about killing bugs, which have led us to a lot of, problems like AMR, antimicrobial resistance and all that. There are philosophies of healthcare that are more centered on actually reinforcing our immunities and our systems than actually going out to get rid of, to go to war on bugs. Can we incorporate this type of philosophies more into our way of thinking about health and our way of thinking about the environment? So there are various elements. So I could talk about, ecocide, genocide, and epistemicide. Since I have just 1 or 2 more minutes, what do we need to do if we want to decolonize bioethics? In the first place, we need to accept that bioethics is a discipline that needs to be pluriversal. Pluriversal means it needs to draw from various traditions while trying to see what we all desire and what we all share, and work in a way that we can actually allow what the Latin Americans say, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world in which many worlds fit together. This requires understanding different people. It doesn't necessarily mean even agreeing, but understanding is important. Second, there is an exercise, I think, that is important, which is an exercise of epistemic humility. And the exercise of epistemic humility, and Angus mentioned this in a different way in his presentation, is that, look, there is no view from nowhere. Some people claim that they have objective views. Every view is positioned, especially in ethics. And we need to be humble enough to recognize that our positionality imposes limitations. And therefore, when we are proposing something, we are proposing it from a particular viewpoint, which cannot be a view from nowhere, because none of us is God or some extraterrestrial creature that's looking at the world from outside and being able to say, this is what ought to happen. We are embedded in realities. And it is these realities that inform our normative judgments. And therefore, we should also be willing to listen to people who may have a different normative view, a different normative experience, and see how we can actually exchange views and arrive at, if possible, at some form of consensus. This will avoid a form of ethical colonization or bioethical colonization that is actually sometimes taking place. Finally, that deep engagement with the local values that was also mentioned. One of the earlier papers I wrote was talking about healthcare ethics. It is very interesting. If you go to a healthcare center in Ghana, people talk, the first thing people do when they arrive in the hospital, they call the nurses like sister nurse or mama nurse or brother doctor, which is that people want to establish a relationship that is based on trust and based on a certain familial type relationship, because that is important to them. Relationships are important. Now, if I go in there and I start showing my patient's rights and patient's charter justice, and these are your entitlements, it does not work. And let's even ask ourselves, we continue to insist on autonomy and patients' rights and all that. This is a reaction to historical experience of paternalism and abuse. Now, when you have paternalism, which is the abuse by the pater, the father figure, somebody is doing something wrong. You don't solve the problem only by just empowering the filius, the son, the child. You need to ask why the system is encouraging paternalism. And maybe that is because of power, money, and other things. And until we question those structural values, we will not solve the problem by just going around for autonomy. And the same thing for research participants. People join research projects sometimes because they believe that a good can come out of it. So are they participants? And if we take seriously the word participant, it means they are co-owners. But it is not comfortable for us for them to be co-owners, because if they are co-owners, then they have to be sharers of the benefits. And we don't want that. So we want them to sign something. That way they've signed, we've taken the data, we've even compensated them. And if anything good comes out of it, it is ours. Intellectual property, how many of us who claim to know something have actually created it out of zero? we all depend on other people for the knowledge that we have. And why is it that we give intellectual property 100% to one person? These are things that are structurally wrong. And we need to decolonize. And decolonization simply means we need to dismantle this empire of knowledge on which our discipline is sitting in order to broaden it to include other ways of thinking and other ways of understanding. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Caesar. I think you covered both the conceptual and practical aspects, right? The three pillars of coloniality and, what's happening on the ground in terms of healthcare research, and so forth. We have time for a quick question for Caesar. Maybe I'll ask you, Caesar, at the end of the day, when you apply a pro-reverse approach or promoting such a philosophy, isn't the goal ultimately some sort of universal project because you're ultimately looking for shared values?
Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, we all share this planet. We share this space, and technically speaking, we are all part of one species, if we want to call it that way. So there will be shared values. And there is a form of, I wouldn't call it universalization, but there are common projects. Now, the pluriversal approach is not so much to say, let's go and look for one gold standard, but what is it that we need to do so that everybody at least can have the capability or the possibility to flourish? This is what we're looking for. And I think that's what ethics is really about. Ethics is, for me, ethics is about the relationships and how these relationships do not crush some people while working to the advantage of others.
Thanks. Yeah. I see there are 4 questions, and I'll take 3 of them at the end of all 3 talks. But right now, I think there's a question that's pertinent to you, Caesar, because you talk about your inability to get people to listen to people from Ghana, Liberia, people with a lot of experience in outbreak control. And the question is, how do you persuade those in power to listen to the alternative stories and values of those not in the position of power?
If it were that easy, I think it would have been solved by now. But we need to highlight also, we need to reverse that narrative of failure that Angus mentioned, right? So the narrative of failure is usually the one that we say, well, health systems in low and middle income countries are fragile. They do not live up to the WHO standards on I don't know what. That is the narrative of failure. But there's also a narrative of failure of the West or of the high income countries. The narrative of failure, this may sound ironic. In Africa, we didn't defeat COVID with vaccines. The vaccines came late. Not everybody took them. Many countries never even got to 50% of their population vaccinated. Yet we're here post-COVID. That's a narrative that we ought to tell that story. Of course, it's a very uncomfortable story to tell, because whereas countries that had millions, it's like, I often give the example, it's like there's a storm in the village and you are living in a very nice house and your house falls down and the person living in the shack next door has his
Since we have lost Caesar. Hi, Caesar, can you hear us?
Hello?
Yeah, we lost you. I don't know about the rest. I lost you.
I think my connection went down for a second. Yeah, so we need to tell more stories of the successes of what people are doing in the countries that are usually characterized by failure.
Thanks. That's very helpful. I'll move on to our next speaker, Mark Tan Kiak Min, who perhaps had the toughest job because he's been responding to both Angus and Caesar. Mark is a lecturer at the Medical Ethics and Law Department, Faculty of Medicine at the University Technology Mara, UITM. He's a certified healthcare ethics consultant and mediator and chairs the clinical ethics committee, as well as coordinates the clinical ethics consultation service at Hospital Al Sultan Abdullah at UITM. He has been involved in establishing clinical ethics services at many other healthcare institutions in Malaysia, which is a difficult job. Mark researches on medical ethics education, professionalism, and clinical ethics, focusing on end of life and advanced decision making. Right, so he has written an article on beyond a Western bioethics in Asia and its implication on autonomy. So we heard a lot of criticism of autonomy, and maybe you can talk about that later. Over to you, Mark.
Sure, thanks, TC. Just let me put up my slides. Yeah, so thank you very much for that invitation. I discovered last week that it was because of that paper that got me into trouble today. Now I have some slides and I'm just gonna go through them, and I'm happy to take questions. And I think the richness would be in the discussion we have afterwards about how we can work through these ideas. But just to provide a little bit of background, I'm a third generation Malaysian of Chinese descent. So my grandparents came from China, and well, I would consider myself to be Malaysian. I've studied in Ireland, in the UK, and in the US. So I don't know, perhaps similar to Angus, I've also been a beneficiary of coloniality, perhaps, in the ethics education that I've received. But I currently work now in Malaysia, primarily in building clinical ethics capacity. And that's probably where I would come from in terms of looking at the ethics that works or doesn't work in a clinical setting in the Malaysian healthcare system. And like TC mentioned, this is more of providing a response, sharing some ideas rather than an in-depth discourse. And listening to Caesar just now was really motivating and mind-blowing for me, really. It's also difficult because this is Southeast Asia. It's about 4.5 million kilometers squared. It has 8.5% of the world's population, and it's so culturally and ethnically diverse. There are over 100 languages spoken in this region. And sometimes even within a single country like Malaysia, right? There's just so much diversity that it's really difficult to look at some universal principles that now although the title of the talk is Southeast Asia, but my experiences are probably limited to the Malaysian context. And that's unfortunate, really. Bioethics is and quite interestingly, I think listening to the previous speakers, a lot of the ethics that's done in Malaysia is based on the tradition that it has to be done by a doctor, rather than including people like theologians and philosophers. In the Ministry of Health, for example, doctors take the lead. Most of the ethicists are doctors. In fact, I'd say all of the ethicists are doctors. The other point that has already been mentioned is that the predominant view of bioethics as we understand it today in the Southeast Asian, at least the Malaysian context, is based on Anglo-Americans. Are taught about the 4 principles: respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice. That's the basic thing that everyone needs to know. So there have been some people who have, argued that this could be a form of colonization, where there are attempts to influence people like Western ethical principles. But on the ground, we also realize that there may be some mismatch between Western and non-Western values in terms of the principles. And I'll illustrate this in the context of autonomy shortly. But before that, I think that bioethics really works when it's contextualized and relevant to the local setting. And it's probably from this point, or this thought, that I probably thought about today's session. And the question was, how do we get a locally contextualized, relevant, and practical bioethics in this region? And in preparing for this, it may have been mentioned, I think the concept of systemic colonization. So, thinking about how we know what we know, and thinking about whether bioethics in Southeast Asia should be the same, should adopt the same approaches, the same principles as Western bioethics, be it in clinical practice, in research, in teaching, actually in learning ethics, in doing ethics, and even being ethical, right? So I think if we think about this concept, I want to, like what DC mentioned earlier on, globally reject ideas from the West, or their methodologies. But I think we need to critically evaluate what we have, what we know, discern, modify, reinterpret, and perhaps even co-create things, knowledge, practices that work in the local context. It's also interesting to note that there's a lack of literature right now in the Southeast Asian region, at least, with regards to decolonization, as compared to, say, Latin America or Africa. And so that's something that I think we need to work on. I don't know if it's because, some of the literature has been published in a different language that doesn't come up in a search. Maybe it's in a different, it's not even in Roman alphabets, right? So, but whatever we have, it's very limited. And I think this is really where we can learn and we can collaborate so that we can create something that's relevant. And how do we do that? Because Southeast Asia is just so diverse. And to find unity in this diversity. And the other thing that I thought about in preparing for this was that perhaps it's not just about decolonization, but a reverse colonialism, where actually there are things that we can also contribute to the ethics conversation of the West. And so, we've talked about post-colonialism, but, is it time for us to perhaps, inform others also work in their space? And so perhaps, it should have been lessons for Southeast Asia, as well as lessons from Southeast Asia. Now, I just, with the time that I have, wanted to look at perhaps the concept of autonomy and how it kind of interplays in this discussion. I mean, there are other examples that can be used, such as, you know, how the solidarity or reciprocity work out. But really, I was interested in this topic when I was doing my master's, because I found that whatever I learned didn't really apply very well, didn't sit very well with the patients I saw. Now, we're all used to the concept of respect for autonomy, which is usually focused on individual autonomy. And we're taught that, you know, this is the right of the individual to make decisions for themselves. It's part of respect for humans and respect for persons, and the person needs to have liberty and agency in order to make those decisions. However, what I found, especially in the Malaysian context, and perhaps as I did more reading, even in the Asian context, is that autonomy doesn't really always belong only to the individual. And community affected decision making, especially at the end of life. The role of the family was the underlying consideration that, you know, distinguished bioethics in this region, which was based on duties and obligations rather than an individualistic rights-based approach to autonomy. And we can see this influence of family because whenever a patient comes to the hospital, they're accompanied by family. You know, most of the time there's family who accompanies the patient throughout their hospital stay. Many times, families would become the interpreter, the advisor to the patient, which is something that probably would be frowned in the West. In terms of making decisions on behalf of someone else. And some of it was taken from a family member who may have known more about the patient's condition or the patient's medications. And, you know, patients actually appreciated their family members being part of the decision-making process, being part of that conversation. And so we realized that, hey, perhaps there are reasons for this, right? Perhaps it was about the relationship that we had as a family unit, the interplay between the independence and the interdependence of an individual with their family. Looking at the family as the individual as a smaller self within a larger self. Concepts of collective responsibility as one family unit versus individual responsibility of a family member. Familial autonomy, family sovereignty. And interestingly, again, importing the concept of filial piety. We've found that a lot of the decisions made by SARS. So, this translated to, you know, needing to think about new ways in obtaining consent for treatment. And I just wanted to perhaps show you an example. During COVID, you know, we needed help from the village heads in order to get agreement or consent from villages in order to get vaccinated. So that was kind of an example of, you know, the collective autonomy, but also in identifying surrogates, determining what is the best for the patient, which would help in end-of-life care. And just to share that, I think right now in Malaysia, at least, we have an opportunity implementing this concept of decolonization, because just 2 days ago, we talked about perhaps having a mental capacity act, and so now we have an opportunity to take what works from other places, such as the UK, to look at it, to evaluate it, and to say what works in the Malaysian setting, so that we can then put in place something that is meaningful and useful. And so I think that's something that we can learn from this concept of decolonization. So my last slide would be just a couple of lessons for and from Southeast Asia. I think we need to collaborate, we need to invest, and we need to build. We need to invest in building local bioethics capacity. And I'm not paid to say this, but Serene about those. I think that's a fantastic example of how we invest in the people that we have here. I think we need to be bold and to collaborate with others, especially in the Southeast Asia region. I think for the other lesson that for example, we learned in Malaysia with COVID was that we had people who were doing marvelous jobs, but we were all working in silos. And it was because of COVID that we came together, we became friends, and we collaborated, and we created stuff which worked and became meaningful. And lastly, I think, we need to raise awareness and create discussions so that more people get interested. And that would help with the empirical research that we do, especially in quantitative, the values, the preferences of the people in our region. And how will this benefit bioethics discourse? I think the lessons that we can provide to others is that it will add new dimensions, raise new questions, and it'll help to shift perspectives perhaps on certain practices and create practices that work in the local context. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was really great. I think you had the hardest job to follow on for everybody else. Okay, so I think now we're going to the interesting parts. We're going to discuss. We open the floor for the questions. While the audience think of questions, let's attend to the ones that were already asked in the chat. So Barry asked about, I guess the origination of the concept of colonization, like who colonized bioethics. He said his understanding is that the field was established by Western scholars. They didn't colonize the field per se. If Western values have dominated the discourse that was established in the West, is it not the responsibility of scholars elsewhere to put forward alternative frameworks? So Barry says from his perspective in the Middle East, he sees Islamic bioethics discourse doing well, established and built by scholars there. He didn't see any anti-colonial rhetoric in the endeavor. So does any of the panelists want to field this question? Or their experiences, maybe?
Well, if you want me to, I can have a go, and maybe others can add to what I say. Who colonized bioethics? I think we need to, unpack the question a little bit. The way bioethics as a field came up was in response to a certain set of issues that arose during the Second World War, after the Second World War in the 1960s. and then the 70s. Now, the problems, the issues that led to that, the abuse of, of patients, participants in research and all that, and certain new technologies that were emerging in healthcare, these were problems that were present in a certain part of the world. And the discipline arose to be able to address and tackle these issues in an ethical way. And therefore, it was informed by those issues. And thus, the way we structure bioethics was informed by that context and that historical moment. People in other parts of the world were going through different problems. And the issue of decolonization then comes when you try to take these solutions that were created at a certain time in a particular place, and you export them acritically around the world. And which is part of, let's say, the colonial project. So it is not one person who sat down and said, let's go and colonize bioethics. It is part of the historical experience that we're living that was just basically continued. Now, do we need to create other alternatives and all that? Yes, and I think many people are already doing that in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. However, in trying to create a new or a different way of looking at things, there are two dangers that are associated with it. One is that it can, the structures within which we are already operating are structures of a great deal of power imbalance. I mean, people like David McCoy have published on the fact that, we all teach, we talk about global health training programs, and a lot of the global health issues are from the global south that we're trying to address. Yet the institutions are all based in the north. Mark mentioned it, trained in Leiden and then in the US and all that. The same thing goes with academic publishing. So there is a certain imbalance in representation of who has ideas and where ideas are published and whose ideas are actually held to be credible. And because of that, it makes it difficult, even when you create another narrative, for that narrative to be able to take hold, because the structures are not in favor of it. And then thirdly, what I personally find very tiresome is that we constantly put on the back foot to have to justify, to be able to say what we have to say. And it gets tiresome. So I have to justify, why should I be talking about African or Asian bioethics in order to be able to talk? Why don't we just have citizenship of all these forms of knowledge without having to go through that exercise of justification? Over. I don't know whether the others want to add to that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great point, because I also did think it was a little bit arrogant of the very people who set up this entire structural injustice in the first place to go like, you know what, you all should do something about it now. And also, but the use of the term Asian bioethics, African bioethics, is in itself still problematic. Either we move towards a situation where everything is bioethics, it doesn't matter where you're from, because even within, say, a country, you can have different schools of thought, different ways of, different kinds of scholarship. Or we move towards, well, there's American bioethics, which is different from Australian bioethics, which is different from European, which can be further separated as well. So I think even the naming itself is problematic, Asian bioethics.
Yeah, sorry if I may come back in on that. It's important because we've had this debate too within African bioethics. Africa is 54 countries, 2,000 different languages, 1.4 billion people. You can repeat the whole thing, just like for Asia as well. Now, it depends on what you mean when you say Asian bioethics or African bioethics. But when I do bioethics and I can call it African bioethics, it doesn't mean that I represent the whole of Africa. It is an expression of one of the several expressions that can come from Africa. So you can call it African if you want to. But the thing is to just take one particular idea, one particular school and say, well, it represents a whole continent or it represents a whole region of the world may be a little bit reductive. And it is true that within even the traditions, African traditions, Asian traditions and all that, there are differences of opinion and differences of positions. And that is the wealth of the tradition. And just like, I mean, yeah, I could call Heidegger German philosophy, but Heidegger is not the same thing as Kant. And so why should we try to reduce, let's say, if I try to reduce German philosophy to Kant or to Heidegger alone, I'll be doing an injustice. And our regions too are made up of a wealth of ideas. Of course, there are certain ideas that are salient, that are common, that we can share, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should, continue to put ourselves in that block, because those blocks are ways of othering others, of ways of othering. And we can play into that trap by continuing to sort of like lock ourselves there and, continue with that narrative. So when you say Asian, it's because it's come out of Asia, but it doesn't mean it represents the whole of Asia.
It's a very good point. So to further on to Caesar's point, Catherine had a very good question that I think Caesar has answered in part already. How does the panel respond to the perception that the creation of regional notions of bioethics, like Asian bioethics, African bioethics, Southeast Asian bioethics, and so on, as a form of addressing the neo-colonialist project as inherently essentialist? In other words, it's a problematic practice that's espoused by the project. Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this? Angus? Mark?
I was going to let Angus go because one of the things in my paper was talking about this notion that's been put on in this question, and perhaps even the notion of a global bioethics, isn't it? And I was going to let Angus have a go first because I actually quoted him in my paper, so he would be the authority really. But yeah, I think that there are pros and cons in segregating as well as trying to find common ground. But I believe that there are certain things in bioethics that we can share this commonality, but at the same time, we do need to contextualize these sorts of things into something that works, because it would be kind of just a thought process if it doesn't work, right? So what's the whole use of thinking about all these? It's to find something that works. Over.
Yeah, I think this is a good point to clarify something that I was talking about. So the difference between top-down and bottom-up kind of approaches. So the suggestion is that that kind of geographical way of thinking about the relationship between the particular and the general is to talk, or at least from my perspective, is to talk about our starting point. So one of the worries here is to do with this kind of set of assumptions about what our starting point is, and that a few middle-aged white guys on the east coast of the US in the 1970s kind of formulated what is the approach for everybody to take. So that's a kind of classic top-down approach. So, the argument then becomes, well, do we have 5 principles or 3 principles or, whatever it might be? And that's one approach that you could take. The idea about starting with the bottom and the local is that we need to understand where people are coming from. And the danger of the alternative is that you rule out various kinds of ideas that are important to people, various practices that are central to their lives. So Mark mentioned the idea of filial piety. within a secular Western way of thinking, there's a danger that that's just dismissed. But that is something which is crucial, essential to many Asian societies and other societies around the world. Or think about another example. Something I've been thinking about recently is the role of respect and valuing of ancestors. Now, in a Western way of thinking, it's like people just don't even know what to do with that. You know, they even have a problem with future generations because they'll cite a bit of Parfit that's basically is used as a refutation for even having concerns about future generations. So it's starting with the local allows us to try and articulate and understand the practices of people's lives and what is of value to them. But of course, we can link this into more universal ideas about what's important to people is because they want to live the life that is important to them. So it's about well-being and flourishing and so on, and ideas about respect. So how people flourish is going to be distinctive in different parts of the world, in different cultures and so on. But that doesn't mean because we are starting with the local and we're starting out from a commitment to respecting the local, that we then have nothing in common with everybody else. So of course it's complicated, but the starting point for me is thinking about we should begin with an assumption of respect for other people and other cultural, religious, societal traditions, and listen more to each other. Some of you might wonder why I have one of my own photographs on my first slide. That TC pointed it out, and again, I'd use this as a. Hopefully, you would just look at that and think, oh, that's a nice, pretty picture. And generally speaking, I don't use a lot of diagrams and pictures and so on my slides. You know, I can't hide from my training in philosophy, which is all about words. But I've become more and more interested in how we can communicate in other ways apart from just presenting arguments to each other or reasoning. And photography is one way to try and do that. So there's a parallel here to do with, I could tell you a lot about that photograph, when it was taken, where it was taken, what I was trying to capture, and so on. So that's the equivalent of the local. But the picture is also important to me because it's expressing certain kinds of concerns and ideas that relate to these ideas of flourishing. So it is taken at a particular place in Australia that had suffered a devastating bushfire about 18 months before the picture was taken. So the picture is of a rock, but it's also of a bush that has been burnt. So it's and I used that picture a lot during talks that I give about COVID, because I think there's what I'm trying to get at is a set of universal, inverted commas, values in relation to flourishing, and how there's a kind of permanence which is represented by the rock, but there's also a vulnerability. There are various threats to our security that come through things like climate change. So we ought to be concerned about various kinds of issues to do with climate change because of the impact that they have upon us as particular kinds of biological creatures that have various kind of requirements that are essentially threatened by things like climate change. So hopefully you could see that picture as being a parallel to the kind of bottom-up approach to thinking about these things. It's a picture that's taken with, I could bore you for ages about which particular camera and which particular film I used and so on. But the idea is that that's capturing a particular moment. That's the ultimate kind of locality the groundedness of a particular experience that I had on a particular day, but it also has universal features. But the idea is that if we're interested in a photograph, then it is about that photograph. Just as when it comes to thinking about respecting local traditions, we need to understand those local traditions. We need to respect, rather than why I was referring to neo-colonialism, is this danger that there's a lack of respect. There's a set of assumptions that we have the answers, and these are the answers. Look, they're in our document of 150 pages or whatever. It was produced in Geneva after lots of consultation and so on, so it must be true. That's the problem that I have with a lot of these kind of approaches.
Thanks, Angus. You spoke about communication. You spoke about English as, sometimes constraining the way you can think, right? Because there's a way the concepts of English are understood. So it's all about trying to sort of dismantle the power structures through language. And perhaps one way, and something that the Southeast Asian Bioethics Network is trying to do, is to sort of promote publication in other languages. There's a question here relating to power, right? And from the members of the audience, one of the question is, decolonization is all about trying to sort of dismantle power structures, right? And so would a bottom-up approach, I should say, a bottom-up local approach, really be capable of doing that? And there's another question, I'm going to combine the two questions, is whether or not we really ought to explore a middle ground approach, so something between the bottom-up and the top-down approach. And one practical thing we think about is really our publications. You can talk about local values, using local languages, and get them into publications, of course, but they might not be well cited, you see. So there's still all these kind of structures of power that we have to adhere to in order to pursue our careers. So how do we actually try to dismantle power structures through the decolonization movement?
Do you want to go first, Caesar?
Well, okay, I can have a go. How do you dismantle the power structures? And then, yes, it is a long task because it is multi-layered, right? So we have what we need to do at the local level, even at the regional levels or national levels, and what we can do even in terms of the international levels. It is true that, okay, I'll give you an example. I just finished writing a paper on, it's yet to come out, on subsidiarity, which is another principle that I think is important, which is the fact that, instead of trying to solve the problems from the top to the bottom, it is important that those who are closer to the problem be empowered to be able to solve the problem. That is what subsidiarity is about. But in any case, we were going to publish in one of the top-ranking journals. And when they accepted the paper, they asked for the open access charges, right? Open access charges of $5,000. Now, people who live in many parts of the world, that is more than 4 months or 3 months' salary to be able to publish. And if you're able to publish open access in that journal, what is going to happen is that you will get many citations. So your rankings, let's say your academic capital, goes up, and even the institution to which you belong goes up. Now, okay, we've succeeded to publishing that because the publisher has agreements with a university like the University of Oxford, which is which is what it is, and therefore you're not even required. It wasn't necessary for me to pay. Now, what does something like that mean in real life? It means that if you are sitting on the margins of the world, the tables are turned in such a way that you are in a game in which you can't win. Because even if you decide, well, I will not publish in those journals, then your rankings, even your promotion system, whatever, your H index and all that will not grow. Your institution will not grow. And the university rankings are also based on a lot of these metrics. Yet these metrics are are premised on certain assumptions. So you're fighting against, I mean, so basically you're battling against a system that is skewed in a certain way. If, let's say, people in the global south, if we had the capacity to work together, then with large numbers, we can also, as it were, change the narrative. But as an individual, sometimes it is very difficult to be able to make any difference. And that is why organizations like this, the Asian Bioethics Network and other, networks that are growing, can help to bring voices together to be able to demand certain changes. Now, it is true that, yes, these might, and I see in one of the questions talking about essentializing. No, you don't necessarily need to essentialize, but there are certain problems that are shared. And when problems and challenges are shared, and people are able to come together, we may be able to address these problems in a better way. So I think, we need to keep in mind these structural challenges. Even talking about, Angus mentioned, WHO documents that we bring in experts from everywhere to come and sit down and put them together. Then we go in and look at the experts that we have invited, even the experts that we've invited from, let's say, low and middle income countries from Africa and Asia are the experts that have been trained in Harvard and in Oxford and in places like that. Is it that you have to be part of a certain tune, you have to be able to sing a certain tune to be able to be heard? And this is where we really need to take seriously this particular challenge, the relationship between the universal and the local. Let us remember that there is no universal. The universal doesn't exist anywhere. It exists in locations. And therefore it is local. And if whatever claims to be universal is not informed by the local, then it is actually out of this world. It doesn't exist in this world. And that is why the bottom-up approach to be able to inform anything that claims to be at the top is so important. Because really, think about it, when we talk about global, where does the global exist? On another planet? It exists in locations. And those places are local. So they must inform what we call global. Over.
Okay.
I completely agree. And I think the idea of accepting this idea that our starting point is the local is partly about showing respect to the local, but it's also how you could address some of these power issues. So I'm skeptical about an idea about going for some middle ground, as it were, between top down and bottom up. The point of what I was suggesting is that we are embedded within the local, and that's our starting point. It's just that a certain group, a particular group or different groups across the world universalize their localism rather than allowing respect for other people and other traditions. And then across those different diverse localisms, there is then a set of values which we can see being arising from what Caesar mentioned to do with the idea of compromise, or something which exists between different kinds of groups. And I was referring to some of those, such as well-being, flourishing, ideas about respect, and so on. So notice that they are not contentful in a way. The content of what flourishing means is going to differ in terms of your historical context or your geographical context. Flourishing is something which we must understand from a bottom-up perspective, from a particular local perspective. Whatever skills I happen to have in relation to being able to survive at the moment are not the skills which would allow me to flourish during the Ice Age in the UK. You know, I don't know how to skin a mammoth. But if I was living at that time, I would have had to have developed those particular skills. So historically and geographically, the notion of what it is to flourish is going to be distinctive. But there is a sense in which at least part of that has to be common between those different kinds of localisms. But it's this idea about ideas about respect and the fact that power relationships come in, and we can tell a historical story about how particular ways of looking at bioethics they've moved from the local to the global, but they are still particular kinds of traditions, particular values. You know, what does the Four Principles approach tell us? It tells us the most, I think, about the kinds of values, the kinds of principles which were held to be important at a particular moment in time by a particular group of people.
Okay. The next question is for Mark. Renati asked, your mentioning of relational autonomy is especially relatable to Indonesia, my country. So my question is, do you think that this rethinking of local bioethics could be robust enough to lead to legal implications in the future? So I have noticed that most healthcare-related laws in the region still adhere to the Western-backed bioethics field, which is already developed, such as the one you mentioned about autonomy.
Thanks, Serene. Yeah, I was looking at that question, and so basically, I think it comes back to that question about, who colonized bioethics and so on. But, for example, now, well, in my educational journey, most of the bioethics that I've learned is Western. And I think when I come back to a place where perhaps bioethics is still at its infancy, especially in its thought processes, and so a place where there's no literature to back things up, I think that's one of the problems. So is that we need to have more literature out there to help us back us up. And eventually when we talk about law, again, ethics should inform the law, and laws change over time. And so while the laws that we have at the moment may have been enacted based on Western kind of ideas of ethics, if what we do and what we find is that it doesn't fit, there is place for change. But the thing is, we need to get that out there, because like I think what was mentioned earlier, there's this constant need to justify. Because again, when people look at it, they go onto Google and they search, and what they get is a Western idea. And if we don't start, publishing what we find in terms of what works, then it's going to be very hard to convince. But if we do, then certainly those laws should and will change in time.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We are running out of time very shortly, and we're going to conclude the webinar. I'm going to throw one quick question to each of the panelists, right, for some final quick response. There's always a question of who are we decolonizing, right? And what role are we decolonizing? Teacher, researcher, funder, and so forth. So just one quick point on that you'd like to make in this aspect, like, what sort of practices, what counts as success, for example, for decolonization. Angus, any final thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the overall message that I was trying to give is to say to people within the Southeast Asian region, have confidence in your starting point. And that doesn't mean that you can't also critique, of course, various aspects of society. where you are. Maybe you are critical of patriarchal societies and so on. You know, that actually coming to have confidence and valuing your own starting perspective doesn't mean that you have to endorse absolutely everything. Just as there are lots of things about the UK, believe me, I would bore you for ages, that I detest. I find really problematic. But that's also my starting point in life. So it's, some of us have the privilege of coming from particular parts of the world where it's just assumed that the kind of assumptions that we have are those that are powerfully adopted by the kind of power structures within the world, whether it's academia or more broadly. And the central point that I was trying to make is just to say to people, have confidence, articulate your values, but that doesn't mean that they need to necessarily be endorsed completely.
Mark?
Yeah, I think that you know, the take home for me is that we need to be bold, we need to collaborate, and I think at times we can also agree to disagree when, and the aim is really to find that common ground, and to work at that, right? To make something that works in the local context.
Caesar?
Yeah. Anyway, as you can see, I have a painting of Bob Marley behind me. Bob Marley, one of his songs says, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. We need to free ourselves from the colonial structures that we have inherited, even within our own minds. And this is where having confidence in ourselves and in our culture, and even being critical of our own context, matters. But that is an exercise not of only just looking and blaming the colonizer or going out in that way and criticizing other people, but also engaging in an act of self-criticism, because we are part of the problem just as we can be part of the solution. So deep reflection to ask ourselves in our activity as bioethicists, which agendas are we really reinforcing? And that is where, we can respond to Bob Marley's redemption song. We can redeem bioethics.
Thanks, Caesar. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to express my thanks, especially to the speakers and to the audience.